Today our study is Nehemiah chapter 1. This is the first time in the Bible we hear of Nehemiah, and we begin to find out who this man is. The story begins in the city of Susa, Persia. This is the same city where the biblical story of Esther takes place, and the Bible recounts how Daniel, another famous Jewish exile who lived a century before Nehemiah, received a vision that took place in Susa. Today, the ruins of the city exist about 150 miles north of the Persian Gulf in the modern country of Iran. But in its day, it was one of the three royal capitals of the Persian Empire. The first chapter of Nehemiah is only 11 verses, 7 of which are a prayer by Nehemiah, and 4 of which introduce that prayer. This is Nehemiah's primary reaction to hearing that the walls of Jerusalem are broken down and burned. Note that Jerusalem is over 1,000 miles to the west, and he's probably never been there before. So as we read this passage, a question comes up right away. Why was Nehemiah so upset to hear the Jerusalem walls were destroyed? After all, the city had been destroyed by the Babylonians 140 years ago, before Nehemiah was even born. He would have grown up knowing about the state of affairs in Judah, so why the big surprise? Why such an emotional reaction to the report he gets from his brother Hanani? Well, this is where it's very helpful to read Ezra, the book that just precedes Nehemiah. In Ezra, we find out that the earlier Jewish returnees years before succeeded in rebuilding the altar and temple, but not the walls. When they tried, they ran into vigorous opposition by the surrounding rulers, who had even convinced Persian king Artaxerxes to rule that all such efforts must stop. This is a drastic turnabout from the precedent previously set by King Cyrus. Any hopes that Nehemiah may have had that Jerusalem would one day be restored are quickly dashed by his brother's report. And not only is it the king of Persia who is now opposing the rebuilding effort, but it's his king. You see, Nehemiah is no ordinary Jew. Born and raised in exile, he now works in the Persian royal court. This is probably the only society he has ever known. In fact, he is the king's personal cupbearer. Now, that might not mean much to us today, since most of us have never known someone who does cupbearing as a job, so we might not appreciate the significance of this high position in the king's court. But here's some things I found out. The cupbearer was a top official in the royal household, whose basic duty of choosing and tasting the wine to demonstrate that it was not poisoned, and of presenting it to the king, gave him frequent access to the king's presence and made him potentially a man of influence. And by the way, you should know that Xerxes, the father of Artaxerxes, was killed in his own bedchamber by a member of his own royal court. So it was rather hazardous to be a king in those days. Varied sources suggest something about Nehemiah as a royal cupbearer. He would have been well trained in court etiquette. He would know how to select wines to set before the king. He would be able to determine who was allowed to see his master and enjoy the unreserved confidence of the king. So now we have a better idea of what a cupbearer is. He is not just a servant or a butler. We see that Nehemiah is in an awful predicament. His own king seems to have ordered that the walls of Jerusalem be left in ruin. No wonder Nehemiah's first response is to sit down and weep. We see that his distress is understandable, and we appreciate it better because we cross-referenced our passage in Nehemiah with Ezra. Using cross-references to study the Bible is our Bible study tip for today. This simply means comparing our passage with other related verses in the Bible. Many resources are available to help us find these related verses. For instance, many Bibles, even if they are not study Bibles, list cross-references in footnotes or side margins. Sometimes they are listed in a column in the middle of the page. There are whole books dedicated to helping us find cross-references to virtually every passage in Scripture. If you use a Bible app, the app itself will make it easy to find related verses and access them with a simple tap or click. And many commentaries will place the cross-referenced verses directly in the comments themselves. Cross-references clarify Scripture. They prevent error. It is a fundamental rule of Bible interpretation that a Scripture passage cannot be interpreted in such a way as to render it in conflict with the rest of Scripture. So reading our passages in light of the rest of the Bible is key. They reveal origins and future significance. They show the interconnectedness of Scripture. Oftentimes, cross-references span the entire Bible, New Testament and Old. So not only do we better appreciate Nehemiah's dismay when we compare Nehemiah with Ezra, but we also understand better the rest of this chapter, which is Nehemiah's prayer. As we read this prayer, we are impressed at Nehemiah's wisdom and perspective. The cross-references tell us that he is not just making stuff up off the top of his head or receiving entirely new revelation from God. No, he is being very consistent with what God has already stated through his word. Let me show you what I mean. Nehemiah in his prayer says, "Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, 'If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations.'" He is referring to Deuteronomy 28:63 and 64. "It will please him to ruin and destroy you. You will be uprooted from the land you are entering to possess. Then the Lord will scatter you among all nations, from one end of the earth to the other." Is it not astonishing that even before Israel entered the Promised Land, as they stood on the plains of Moab, ready to cross the Jordan River, God was already warning that he would one day have to remove them and scatter them among the nations? Nehemiah goes on to say, "But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name." Deuteronomy 30:1-3 says, "Wherever the Lord your God disperses you among the nations, when you and your children return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and with all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations where he scattered you." The need of the people to return to God and his faithfulness to regather them are clearly recognized by Nehemiah. As the prayer is concluding, he says, "They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand." Note the cross-referenced passage, Deuteronomy 9:29. "But they are your people, your inheritance that you brought out by your great power and your outstretched arm." Compare these phrases. Your people, redeemed, brought out, great strength, great power, mighty hand, outstretched arm. Nehemiah was obviously a man who knew history and he knew Scripture. He knew the word inside and out and depended upon it, even staked his life on it. So as you study Nehemiah's first chapter today, let's keep in mind that virtually every verse you read, from the mention of Susa to the near afterthought of, "Oh yeah, I almost forgot to mention, I was cupbearer to the king," to the seemingly spontaneous prayer that makes up most of this chapter, all of it is significant to the story, coherent with the rest of Scripture, and completely consistent with God's character and promises.